Good evening. My name is Robert Logan and it's my privilege to welcome you to this May event of the Newcastle Institute. A special welcome to all of you who have come out tonight, and also a special welcome to those who are watching our live stream and on our website. The Newcastle Institute was established in 2004 as an independent organisation aiming to stimulate informed, thoughtful and rational discussion of public issues. The Institute does not take a position on any issue, but encourages constructive engagement of the whole community in the development of new ideas that are of importance to us all. We recognise that Newcastle has been a place of learning for thousands of years, and we pay our respects to the original custodians of this land, the Awabakal and the Warramai peoples, to elders past and present, and we thank all of those who continue to make Newcastle a place of discovery and a place of sharing of ideas. Tonight we are talking not just about tax, but really what sort of country do we want to be? The Henry Tax Review, published in 2010, aimed to make Australia's tax system fit for purpose for the 21st century. But few of the 138 recommendations were implemented. It's our great privilege tonight to have the author of that review, Dr. Ken Henry, with us. Currently, he is Chair of the National Finance Council, the Australian Climate and Biodiversity Foundation and Wildlife Recovery Australia, and a Non-Executive Director of Accounting for Nature Limited and the Digital Finance CRC. Dr. Henry served as Secretary to the Treasury from 2001 to 2011 and therefore was an ex officio member of the Reserve Bank Board. He chaired the Howard Government's Tax Review Task Force in 1997 to 98, the Rudd Government's Tax Review published in 2010, and the Gillard Government's White Paper on Australia in the Asian Century in 2011 and 12. In 2022 and 2023, he led the independent statutory review of the Biodiversity Conservation Act of New South Wales. Dr. Henry was Chair of the National Australia Bank from 2015 to 2019 and a Non-Executive Director of the Australian Stock Exchange and affiliated entities from 2012 to 2022. Dr. Henry is a recipient of the Centenary Medal and was a Companion of the Order of Australia, made a Companion of the Order of Australia in 2007. He's a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences Australia, the Australian Institute of International Affairs and the Australia-New Zealand School of Government. Ken was awarded a PhD in economics from the University of Canterbury, New Zealand in 1983. He has been awarded an Honorary Doctor of Business from the University of New South Wales and an Honorary Doctor of Laws from the Australian National University. Ken will speak to us for 15 or 20 minutes or so, and then I will have a brief conversation with him here on the stage, and then it will be over to you for your questions. Would you please join me and welcome Dr. Ken Henry.
Thank you very much for that rather long introduction. I'm feeling quite old. And for two reasons. One, because that forced me to reflect on quite a number of years spent in public policy work. And also because it really is quite a long time. And we're getting a bit of feedback, are we? Or is that okay? Or not? Yeah. And there were times, you know, when during that period I thought we had it, we had this all figured out. And when I say we, who's we? I guess public policy advisors, or at least a set of public policy advisors who, at relatively young ages like me, chose to devote their life to public policy, devote their lives to public policy. And there were quite a few of us. I joined the Treasury in August of 1984. I grew up in Taree, just north of here. Went to university in Sydney at the University of New South Wales, went across to Christchurch to do my PhD with a fellow who was supervising my honours thesis, and took off to Christchurch halfway through. And anyway, he said, "Why don't you come across and do your PhD?" But when I came back to Australia, the thing that really got me back to Canberra, I mean, rather than going off to North America and spending my life as a somewhat, well, I don't know, as an academic economist, what got me back was that there was a lot going on. And, you know, the thing about academia, and some of you would know this from your own careers and others from watching academics, is that you can spend a lifetime puzzling about issues. Actually, my younger brother is one of these people, although he's retired now, one of those, what they call them, emeritus professors. But and so he's still puzzling about issues, and that's great. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. But if your passion is economics, and your passion is making a difference to people's lives, and that's really what economics is about, when you see an opportunity to do something, when you see an opportunity to make a difference, you're probably going to want to step into it, and that was what motivated me. And when I got to the Treasury in 1984, I discovered that there was a team of people in that department, all of a similar age, who had been motivated by pretty much the same thing. And we've remained firm friends over all of those years. So, to get back to the story, there was a time when we thought we'd figured it all out. And we had great success as a group of advisors in advising government on how the Australian economy might be reformed. And when I say reform, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that the economy is more capable of providing people with opportunities to live good lives. That's what I mean by it. And yeah, as I say, we thought we had it all figured. There have been some very unsettling surprises, though, in more recent times. Actually, when I say more recent times, I'm thinking over the last 20 years. Some rather unsettling surprises. And we've not handled those very well, and that's really what I want to talk to you about tonight. The situation we find ourselves in right now is that we have set up what I've described as an intergenerational tragedy. And it's a tragedy in the classic sense, in that it certainly could have been avoided. There were people who, during most of the past 20 years, would have told you, I'm talking now about our political leaders, would have told you with great confidence that it was all right. It was fine, nothing to worry about. and that the risks that people like me were worrying about have been overstated. As a matter of fact, only a couple of weeks ago, in a public forum, I had one of our senior politicians more or less say that what I was talking about to that audience, which is similar to what I'm talking to you about, that it was exaggerated and things weren't really as bad as I was portraying them to be. But that was a member of the government, of course. And it's always the members of the government who don't want to concede that anything needs to change. That's true these days. I wouldn't have joined the Treasury in 1984 if it was true back then. Back then we had a government that took responsibility for the condition that Australia was in and committed themselves to firstly identifying the problem, calling it out, and they called it out, then developing a narrative that would bring the population along with them in dealing with the problems that were called out, and then having the courage and the energy to get on with the task. And they were followed by the Howard government that kept at it as well for at least 5 years, maybe even a bit longer. Actually, probably right up until the revenue started flowing in from the resources boom, which really took off in late 2003. And I think that really marks the end of Australia's period of economic reform. And yet, as I'm going to explain to you in just a moment, that should have sparked a renewed appetite for even more ambitious reform. And I'm going to take you through a little bit of economics. It's not really complicated economics, but as I said on an ABC Radio interview this morning on a podcast, I actually don't think many economists understand it. So anyway, let's see. I know this is a very busy slide. We may not get to any other slide. This is my attempt to capture on one page the architecture of the intergenerational tragedy that I've been talking to people about. The driving elements of it, as I see it, are that we have an adversarial political system. Matter of fact, we have an adversarial everything. I must say I've never understood, and there's presumably lawyers in the room who will want to argue this point with me. Well, of course they will, because that's what lawyers do. But how on earth did anybody ever come up with the notion that if you get people arguing with one another for long enough, the truth will emerge? It's just, of course, complete nonsense. But that's what our political system does. And so we have an adversarial political system. Worse than that, we have political leaders and business leaders, from my long experience of dealing with them, who have a mindset that's better suited to colonial rulers of the 18th century. It's essentially a mindset that sees Australia as a good source of plunder. The plunder of natural resources, which we still have a lot of that China and India and Korea and Japan and other countries want to buy. And those leaders of ours in both politics and business, they celebrate exports like nothing else. And to them, it matters little that the sector that they celebrate employs only 2% of the Australian workforce, that it makes 50% of the profits that the entire corporate sector of Australia makes, and that most of the income, about 3/4 of it, maybe 80%, goes overseas to foreign shareholders. But you know it was the same in the 18th century, right? We have leaders who think it's okay to subsidise the ongoing destruction of the Australian natural environment. We have leaders who have failed to deal with climate change and are finding it really hard, impossible to deal with the effects of climate change. And so the costs of those are political cans that are being kicked down the road and have been kicked down the road for years and years and years now. We have a complete misunderstanding of the Asian century. It's difficult for me to describe. No, it's easy enough to describe. It's really difficult to understand how deep this misunderstanding goes, but perhaps this little anecdote might reveal something of it to you. So, yeah, I did lead the development of the white paper on Australia in the Asian century. And it was the most consultative, the most rewarding policy development process I've ever been involved in 40 years. And the night that Tony Abbott was elected Prime Minister, or became Prime Minister, he or his Chief of Staff, and it's on all issues it's impossible to tell which was calling the shots, one of them issued an edict to the public service to pulp every copy of that report, to delete every web page reference to it and every electronic link, every digital link. It's the sort of stuff you'd read in a work of fiction, but it actually happened. He would probably say that it contributed nothing, so we didn't need it. And I've heard one of the ministers of that government, a senior minister in that government, say more or less that. Didn't learn anything from reading it. Actually, I thought, well, you probably didn't. You probably didn't. You should have. But a complete misunderstanding of the Asian century, and I'm going to show you a chart in about 3 minutes that will explain what I mean. And then, and this one, avoiding the consequences of a rather peculiar demography that we have set up in Australia, demographic dynamic that we've set up in Australia, that has the dual characteristics of population ageing, which is common to a lot of countries, but also strong population growth, which is uncommon. The combination of population ageing and strong population growth, that is really, really rare. But we've got it, and we've got it in spades, and that combination is creating a unique set of problems for Australia. These things in combination, look, I could have been more careful and more clever in the way that I drew these arrows, but I decided I'd fudge it. But in my view, it's those things that explain why our tax system is antiquated. I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. It's those things that explain why we have a structural budget deficit. What I mean by that is that although the Commonwealth budget was in surplus last year, and although I'm pretty sure that a week from now, Treasurer Chalmers will announce another surplus, the budget will then almost immediately go back into deficit. The reason for the surpluses is short-term factors. You might call them cyclical factors. They're not structural factors. The budget is in structural deficit. That will also be revealed in the budget papers, by the way, because the Treasury these days does publish the structural budget position. And it will be revealed, and I guess it'll be something of the order of 2 to 2.5% of gross domestic product, which is getting up towards $60 billion a year in dollars of today. And that's a structural budget deficit position, and that means that on average, the Australian economy going forward is going to be adding that much, at least, to public debt. And that, of course, as the slide makes clear, is a burden that has to be borne by younger people. I'm not going to be around to worry about it. We've got what I've described as an escalating environmental debt due to accelerating cost of both climate change and nature destruction, and an accelerating cost of trying to remediate both those things, or to adapt to climate change, climate adaptation, and to remediate the natural environment. That is an environmental debt that we, this generation and past generations, have produced, and it's a debt that we are passing on to future generations of Australians. It has delivered, this combination of things, very weak growth in gross domestic product, and particularly in gross domestic product per capita, which has been going backwards for some time now. I don't know if you know that. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. The gross domestic product per capita has been going backwards, and it's not all due to COVID. And although we do save a reasonable amount in this country now, although it's not high by the standards of a developed country, our savings are being largely directed to supporting asset price inflation rather than productive business investment. And so those features, in turn, all amount to cost shifting to future generations, and those future generations, because of that set of things, will have a lesser capacity to pay than we do. And of course, they've been priced out of the housing market. I used to say they've lost confidence that they'll ever be able to afford to buy their own home, but that's been true for a number of years now. They're now also being priced out as renters. So anyway, priced out of housing tenures. It's a pretty grim story. And it occurred to me that this was a crisis that should be described as a tragedy when I found young people coming up to me at events, obviously not like this. There's a few young people in this audience, but not a hell of a lot. But public events, young people coming up to me and saying, actually they'd talk about things like, well, I had a conversation with some young people on Anzac Day, and actually not this most recent one, but the one before, who said, we just don't get this stuff about going off to fight for the country. I was a bit taken aback, but then they explained it. They said, what on earth would we be protecting? It's not our wealth, it's yours. It's a bit grim. They said, if somebody of your generation were to issue an edict to the young people to go off and defend Australia, I think what they'd find is the middle finger raised. Like, to defend what? This is not our Australia, this is your Australia. Now, when it gets to that point, and look, I'm sure that's an extreme view. I don't believe for a moment that that is a sort of middle-of-the-road view or a representative view, but nevertheless it was strongly held, said with some force. When it gets to that point, you'd have to say that our leaders have simply failed. More than that, they have breached something that economists and other disciplines refer to as an intergenerational contract, which goes a bit like this. The intergenerational contract, core pillar of it is that the present generation, who has all the power, undertakes to deliver to the generations that follow, who have no power right now, undertakes to deliver the opportunity to have a better life than what we've enjoyed. And without that contract being honoured, the whole thing's at risk. Now, there you go. So I promised to show you this. So Australia's political leaders and the editors of our major newspapers, and certainly the editor of the Financial Review, firmly believe that the resources boom is what is underwriting Australian prosperity. Now, there are two problems with that proposition. The first is I don't know what prosperity they're referring to. I'll come to that. The second is that as a matter of basic economics, that makes no sense. It's an argument, not an argument, it's a proposition in the nature of what you might call trickle-down economics that somehow wants to have you believe that if iron ore prices and coal prices and gas prices, I'm talking about world prices, quadruple, which is what they've done in the past 20 years, they have quadrupled. If those prices quadruple, and as a consequence, a handful of Australian billionaires become multi-billionaires, that's somehow good for the rest, the 98% of the Australian workforce that doesn't work in the mining sector. Now, I've got to say, I have studied economics for a long, long time, and I cannot get my head around that. I simply can't. I can get my head around propositions that I studied when I was actually an undergraduate economics student that says you should expect the converse to be true. So, this line shows the behaviour of something called the terms of trade. I'm sure you've heard people talk about terms of trade all the time, and I wonder if you have any idea what they're talking about because they never explain it. I'm going to explain it to you. The terms of trade is a simple ratio. You know, it's the ratio of the average price received for Australian exports across all commodities that we export, across everything that we export, goods and services alike. So it's the average price of all those things that we export divided by the average price of all those things that we import. Okay? So that's the terms of trade. So when the Australian economy is hit with strongly appreciating prices of iron ore and coal and gas, obviously the average price of our exports goes up. But of course, and that boosts the terms of trade. The terms of trade are also boosted if the average price of the things we import falls. If you think about China's entry, or re-entry actually I should say, into the world economy, which we really started to notice during 2002 and then into 2003. Two big impacts. First, a big demand for iron ore and coal and gas, and the manufacture at much lower costs than we ever could of a whole range of products, driving prices down. Look at the hardware stores that popped up across Australia selling Chinese stuff at unbelievably low prices, right? And then the Officeworks, well, that's owned by common people, of course, same business model, of office equipment that at prices you just couldn't believe. Like, I couldn't believe this stuff. But anyway, that's import prices falling. Both of those things drove an increase in the terms of trade, and you can see it. And it is truly spectacular, right, that by 2011, so between 2003 and 2011, the terms of trade doubled. That's what the line's showing, that the average price of exports doubled relative to the average price of imports. Now, of course, it's natural to think, well, that should make you better off. After all, if I was talking about your terms of trade, and supposing you were in the workforce, the analogue, the personal analogue for a terms of trade is something that economists call the real wage rate. That's just the ratio of what you get paid for what you export into the economy, which is your labour services. You export your labour services and you get paid a wage rate, right? So that's what sits on the top of this ratio, the numerator. And then what's in the denominator of the ratio is the average price of the things that you buy, as measured by the CPI or something or other else, right? And so obviously if you get an increase as an individual, if you get an increase in your real wage, you feel better. You should. You feel better either because your nominal wage rate's gone up or because the price of the things that you buy falls. And conversely, of course, if you find that your wages are not increasing but prices are going up, you feel worse, right? So at the individual level it makes sense, and maybe that's why when the nation's leaders talk about the benefits of an increase in the terms of trade, they just naturally assume that everybody will think that they're a winner. Well, as it happens, the terms of trade came off between 2011 and 2015, and then they went up again. And I've stopped this chart pre-COVID for a reason. But if I were to continue that chart, the terms of trade is now at the highest level it's ever been. Right? So we're back above doubling from 2003. Now, when I studied economics, I learned that, well, I'll be. G'day, mate. I learned that in an economy with Australia's structure, an increase in the terms of trade should lead to weakening labour productivity and weakening real wages growth. And as a matter of fact, Australian economists have done a lot of work on that topic in the late 1920s. And then in the early 1940s, when some Nobel Prize winning economists, well, they won the Nobel Prizes subsequently, and partly for this work, when they considered the question, they actually called out in the celebrated paper on this topic, they called Australia out as a possible clear example of where an increase in the terms of trade would actually damage labour productivity and damage real wages growth. And so when the terms of trade started, and I was the head of the Treasury, I knew all this stuff, right? And I was, actually, you know, I learnt that when I was still a teenager. It's not complex stuff. But anyway, so when I was the head of the Treasury, I asked some of the young people in our macroeconomics division to start following what was happening to labour productivity and to produce charts for me showing the relationship between the terms of trade and labour productivity. And they could never find a relationship. And I gave up asking them. And then when I retired from that role, actually it was years later, it was even, I think I'd even retired from board positions in the commercial sector. Well, pretty much. Anyway, it was during COVID, and I was asked by the Business Council to do some thinking for them on how COVID might be different from the global financial crisis, and I started playing around with some numbers myself. It's remarkable what you can come up with when you do the work yourself. So, the orange line is the same line, that's terms of trade, behaviour. And the white line there is Australia's level of labour productivity. Now, if you can't see an inverse relationship, you're blind. And so it turns out that both the theory and the data support what at least Australian economists should have known for the past 100 years, or nearly 100 years. And yet I would tell you, I doubt that there's anybody in a senior position on either side of politics who understands that at all. But it's really important to understand it because the implications of it are absolutely huge. So, I'll show you. Well, there's one. That chart shows you what's happened to Australian manufacturing as a proportion, manufactured exports, as a proportion of total goods exports. It goes back to 1979, continues right through to the present day. And those vertical lines, the orange vertical lines, that's the period that relates to the period shown in the previous chart. So that's the period that starts in late 2003 and finishes just before COVID hits, right? So that's the bit that you should compare with the previous chart. And it shows a dramatic decline in the proportion of Australia's exports that come from manufacturers. And I can tell you that, because I've recently reviewed the numbers, that if you go back to 1991, 1992, where Australian manufacturers were about 15% of Australia's exports, coincidentally, at that time, manufacturing contributed 15% of the Australian economy. That is, made up 15% of Australia's gross domestic product. Mining made up 5%. Today, manufacturing makes up 5% of the Australian economy, and mining makes up 15% of the Australian economy. What's happened is that mining has replaced manufacturing. And there's very sound economic theory and data to support the contention that, well, that is what you should expect, actually. That's what you should expect. And so it's a little strange, frankly, to hear the present Prime Minister talking about the need to rebuild Australian manufacturing when I don't think any political leader of the past 20 years that Australia has had on either side of politics has understood that it's the mining boom that's delivered this outcome. And if you don't understand that, playing around with, that's a bit unfair, but designing modest interventions to try to build a manufacturing capacity in this thing or that thing or that thing with a few $100 million here or even $1 billion there, it's not going to make a difference. The difference between 5% and 15% of gross domestic product is $270 billion a year. You're not going to fix it with a few $100 million invested here and $1 billion invested there. Every year, you've got to have an extra $270 billion coming out of Australian manufacturing. And it's not going to happen. But we didn't have to be in this place, had people understood and had the political courage, actually, to act on what was needed to frame a decent policy response to the resources boom. And so this is what it's produced, right? This is the annual growth in Australia's gross domestic product per capita, broadly over that 20-year period that I showed earlier. IGR means intergenerational report. The first intergenerational report, which I took leadership of, the design of it, the first intergenerational report was published in 2002 with the May 2002 budget. It's the one that spoke about the ageing of the population and the drain that was going to put on the budget, both because of higher expenditure but also a lower capacity to raise revenue to fund the budget. But in that report, we developed a narrative, which I spoke about on numerous public occasions, and so too did Treasurer Costello on numerous occasions. As a matter of fact, I ran into him last week or the week before in Melbourne. We had a chat about this, how it just seems to have sunk without a trace. We thought it was a really compelling narrative. What do you know? Nobody was interested. I think the reason nobody was interested is because shortly after we published it in 2002, the resources boom came along. And the alternative narrative, which is actually bullshit, but the alternative, excuse my language, the alternative narrative convinced everybody, despite the fact that it had no economics behind it and it had no data to support it, but nevertheless convinced everybody. So in that intergenerational report, we produced projections for each of the 4 decades after 2002. And for the first 20 years, we projected that gross domestic product would grow at only 1.75% a year. Now I say only because in the 5 years before that it grew at 3% a year. And we were castigated. I've got to say, when we published that report, apart from Ross Gittins, who is known to you, or at least some of you, every journalist in the country said, bullshit, 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 you're just trying to scare people. What Ross said, to be fair, was this is meant to be a self-defeating prophecy, which is kind of cute when you think about it. And it was. It was meant to be a self-defeating prophecy. We did want to scare people. We wanted to scare people into action. So we said, yeah, we really think that over the next 20 years, Australia's, on a no policy change basis, Australia's growth in GDP per capita terms is going to slow from 3% to 1.75%. And then we said, and if you want to address the emerging fiscal challenges, the growth in government spending as a result of population ageing, if you want to address that without introducing new taxes or increasing the average rates of existing taxes, you've got to grow the economy faster. You've got to have a bigger tax base. So you've got to grow the tax base faster, right? And what number of an increase in real GDP per capita for 20 years would deliver you that higher revenue base so that you didn't actually have to introduce new taxes and you didn't actually have to increase the average rate of tax on existing bases? And the answer is 2.25%. 0.5% more. We needed to get 0.5% more. Well, all the commentators said, well, hell, that's easy. What are you doing? Scaring the pants off people, and really it's only for 0.5 percentage point of GDP a year. Well, look at what we achieved. 1.25%. And 1.25%, you can do the math, it's a full percentage point a year less than the 2.25% we said would be required. Over 20 years, that's more than 20% difference in people's average incomes. And it more than fully explains the deterioration in the budget structural position. We've had some luck that partly offset it, but that more than fully explains it. So this is a really important story that, as I said, is understood by, I would say, none of our political leaders. Oh, not just them, none of our business leaders. But this is what we looked at growth in government spending. Some people at the time said, oh, you're being too pessimistic about that as well. Have a look. Actually, we projected that the years from 2002 to 2005 were going to be a bit unusual, so we decided to use 2005, which was a future year, obviously. We decided to use that as our base for increasing government spending. We projected that government spending as a proportion of gross domestic product over that period, from 2005 out to 2021-22, that it would grow by 2 percentage points of GDP, which, as I say, in dollars of today is about $54 billion, right? And in fact, it grew by 2.75%. So we understated it. Yeah, we got our numbers wrong, but on the low side. Treasury in last year's budget released projections out to 2032-33, 31-32, which are bang on the 4% that we projected way back in 2002. So they're still projecting a 4 percentage point increase, about $110 billion a year in dollars of today. And then you can see at 2041-42, that 6 percentage point increase. We've done nothing to address the intergenerational challenge, the fiscal challenge posed by population ageing. And a consequence of that is we've built up a structural budget position which is contributing to public debt, which is a present that we are handing on to future generations. We can't be bothered paying for this ourselves, so we're going to get future generations to pay for it. It's a shame that funny... well done. This chart starts with a rather obvious statement. The tax system exists to finance the activities of government. It's worth making the point because our tax system does not finance the activities of government, and as each year goes by, it becomes increasingly worse at financing the activities of government. Doesn't come close. And therefore, that challenge that we called out in Intergenerational Report number 1 in 2002, that if you don't build stronger growth, you're going to have to introduce new taxes, or you're going to have to increase the average rates of tax on existing bases. Guess what? That's exactly what we now have to do. It's not like this is a matter of choice. I mean, we can go on building public debt for a while, but at some point, the rest of the world is going to say to us, you've got rocks in your head. Say to us, you've got rocks in your head. We're just not going to continue to buy Treasury bonds from you people. The way that successive governments now, over a long period of time, have pretended that they were dealing with the fiscal pressures is that they've been relying on two principal tax bases. Firstly, fiscal drag or bracket creep in the personal income tax system. If you think about what's going on here, it's a wonder we haven't had riots in the street, honestly. What's happening here is that young workers have been getting, over this period, the last 20 years, they've been getting increases in nominal wages. That's the money wage they get paid, right? When you've got a progressive personal income tax system, consequence of getting a higher wage each year is that you get pushed into a higher average rate of tax. That's just simple arithmetic. It just happens. So their average rate of tax is going up. But if you look at their real wage rate that I spoke about earlier, yes, it's true their nominal wage rate's been going up, but the prices of everything they're trying to buy have been going up faster. They've actually been suffering reductions in real wages over the past several years. So think about that. We've got a generation or two who are in the workforce suffering reductions in real wages and nevertheless paying higher average rates of tax. I don't recall a previous period in Australia's history like that. I just don't get how politicians can get away with it, honestly. And certainly the politicians that I worked with in the 1980s and the 1990s and the early years of this century, they would not have believed for a second that they could get away with that. So it's a bit of a mystery to me how the hell our political leaders have been able to get away with this for all these years. And then the other principal source of revenue that the Commonwealth budget relies on is something I've called the normal return to capital. Those of you who have studied any economics understand that economists draw a distinction between the normal return on capital and the supernormal or above normal rate of return, which is what monopolists or profiteers and also miners get. And also people who make unexpected capital gains, windfall gains. It's any return that's above what you either expected to get or in any event was necessary in order to induce you to do something that you're doing. That's the normal return, the bit that's required to induce you to do it. But if you get above that, then that's an above normal return. In Australia, we have a relatively high rate of tax on that normal return to capital. One indicator of it is that we are the only OECD country not to have cut its company tax rate this century. And then, of course, at the state level, the principal taxes that are relied upon, you know this, property stamp duties, which are highly volatile, payroll tax, which it's notionally a broad-based tax, but the states compete like hell against one another to attract workers over the border, and so it just gets riddled with holes. And look, it's not as bad as what happened to death duties that, you know, Queensland abolished, and then all the states one by one, tick, 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 and they're all gone. And the Commonwealth too had one as a state duty, and they got rid of it too. And then, of course, resource royalties, which work for Queensland, but especially for Western Australia. And those are the principal growth taxes that this federation of ours presently relies on. Difficult to, you probably shouldn't describe property stamp duty as a growth tax because it's so volatile, but it's growing at the moment. A tax base that would be better suited to budget repair and that would be a lot fairer to future generations would place heavier reliance upon those things on the right-hand side of the chart. And this is really what our tax review published in 2010 pointed out. It's what we pointed out, that we should place more reliance on consumption as a tax base, even though we were not allowed, our terms of reference didn't allow us to make recommendations on the GST. We decided there was a difference between a recommendation and a finding. So we have a finding on the GST that I don't think any commentator in Australia discovered. I mean, I thought this is going to rock people's socks off, and nobody read it. But anyway, it goes to that. Land as opposed to property transactions. Other natural resources, obviously, our iron ore reserves, coal, gas, and so on, but also our forests, on which the price is presently negative. Go figure. Windfall profits and economic rents, greenhouse gas emissions and other environmental externalities. And I think I need a drink, and I think I've spoken for far too long, and I think you need to ask me some questions, and I think some of you need to try to abuse me or at least engage, bearing in mind that I am not somebody who takes the view that argument reveals the truth. Right.
Thanks so much, Ken. Talking about argument reveals the truth. I recall Bob Hawke saying once that consensus meant that we're going to talk and keep talking until you agree with me. As I reflect on what you've said here, I realise this is a complex and multi-layered issue. And as I'm not an economist, I'm trying to get my head around what all this means. Can I have a go at sort of saying a couple of things and tell us if we're on the right track? Yeah. The first thing you talked about was the Asian century, and that people don't understand what that actually means. If the 19th century was the sort of the British imperial century, you know, Britannia rules the waves and the sun never sets on the British Empire. The 20th century was the American century, especially post-World War II, where their culture, politics and economics dominated world thinking. But the 21st century is the Asian century, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Population is one, but if you look at it from Australia's perspective, in 1988, China took 3% of Australia's exports. 3%. But it now takes over 40% of Australia's exports. Asia takes 84% of Australia's exports. China, India, Japan, Korea and others. Europe now only accounts for 5% of our exports. Notions of the mother country and, that's, from an economic perspective, that's long gone. The United States only takes 4% of Australia's exports. They're nowhere near. 84% goes to Asia.
Yeah.
But whilst mining exports have increased exponentially, from what you're telling us, other manufacturing has fallen off the back of the truck.
Yep.
If you overlay that with an adversarial political system, the subsidisation in one of those charts was about environmental destruction, demographic shifts, which means that less than 50% of the population in Australia are now tax contributors, and older people like me are leaving the younger generation holding the can. And overlay that with the mostly almost uniquely Australian idea that residential housing is a preferred investment and not business investment as the preferred option. And essentially Canberra, we have a problem. We're in a bit of strife. How did we end up here? Was it accident, neglect, or just bad policy, or how did we end up here?
Well, it wasn't accident, but it was the other two things, neglect and certainly bad policy. An unwillingness to... Well, firstly, an unwillingness to do the hard stuff. And also, I think what's happened in more recent times is that there's a bit of a bipartisan compact that has developed in Canberra that as a consequence, and I think it's a consequence of the highly adversarial system that we have, and the highly adversarial system which really favours a scare campaign, a negative campaign, over anything positive. And either side of politics can run a scare campaign, right? And I think a sort of bipartisan consensus has emerged that, if there's an issue that can be kicked down the road, then let's kind of agree that we'll just kick it down the road, right? Because I know that you can kill me on it, but you also know that I can kill you on it, so let's just agree that we'll ignore it. Now, that's actually the most upsetting thing about this, right? I mean, in a way, I would like to see the young people out in the streets saying, what the hell are you doing to us? When I was a kid, I went out in the streets campaigning, I know. But anyway, protesting about all sorts of things that I felt very strongly about. And you know what? Those demonstrations had a very big effect. They had a big effect. So I think it's kind of this agreement that the major political parties seem to have come to, which is if we can kick it down the road, let's just agree we will kick it down the road, and then let's argue about things that really don't matter. Let's confect a debate about whether China poses a strategic threat to Australia or not. And let's just argue about that. Let's confect a debate about, well, actually turned out to be no debate about whether we need nuclear-powered submarines, for God's sake. I mean, I'm absolutely, well, I'm not certain, but I'm as near to certain as I could be about anything that was designed to stimulate a debate, right? An quite unnecessary debate. And that's been the nature of things. But there's also been I think there's been a determined effort to avoid the truth. Now, so I'm going to tell you something I really shouldn't tell you, but look, it's 20 years ago, so what the hell? It's 21 years ago, so what the hell, twice. The senior leaders, like the secretaries of government departments, meet every year to talk about big strategic topics, and I think it was 2003, I walked into a secretary's retreat. I mean, God almighty, I can hardly believe that this is true, but anyway it is. And sitting in the room were not only the heads of the government departments, I think 18 of us, but also Chief of the Defence Force, head of the various national security agencies. And the topic of conversation was, and this was the proposition, we were confronting a century, i.e. the 21st century, of American hegemony. The United States would have no contest in the 21st century. This was all based on, you know, that idea, the Fukuyama idea of the end of history that came with the fall of the Berlin Wall, blah, blah, blah. We spent 2 days, kid you not, talking about how we, a relatively minor country, were going to be able to position ourselves most effectively with this big ally of ours, the only elephant in the room, that would be uncontested. And I was asked to, this is really bad, isn't it? Is this? I don't know. Anyway, I was asked to talk about the economic dimension. And I just put up one chart, which showed that on my estimates, the United States would be a bigger economy than America within 15 years.
Yeah, China would be.
I'm sorry, China. China would be a bigger economy than America, than the United States within 15 years. And what the hell were we talking about? They wanted to kick me out of the room. Seriously, they didn't want to believe it. Did not want to believe it. No, that's pretty serious, right? When your leaders they just don't want to hear it. No, that can't be true. Anyway, I choose to believe that it's not true. So we're going to continue to pretend that this is going to be 100 years of American hegemony. Mm-hmm. Those same people now, of course, have changed their spots. No, this has to be the century in which we seek to contain China in order that this be a century of American hegemony. It's completely absurd.
What's been, Ken, the missed opportunities? I remember you were a strong advocate for a super profits tax.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about Norway, that they have a sovereign fund primarily structured around that sort of system,
Yeah.
but mainly on petroleum. But it currently holds 1.7 trillion Australian dollars. That's 1,700 million.
Billion.
1,700 billion Australian dollars.
Mm-hmm.
We had an opportunity to have a similar.
Yeah, we sure did. Of course we did, and we should have. Of course we should have. But you know, when that was proposed, the proposition that was developed in probably a millisecond by the Minerals Council of Australia was that, again, this is so stupid, it's hard to believe it was said, but it was said and believed and turned out to be quite influential. What are you doing putting a tax on the only sector of the Australian economy that's growing? That's what they said. You are killing the goose that's laying the golden eggs. Right? I mean, really, it's so stupid, it's just really hard to believe. But there you go. And of course, the obvious response, which nobody wanted to hear, is, well, of course you want to put a tax on the only thing that's growing in order to allow the other stuff to grow, right? In order to allow to grow the stuff that mining sector is killing. That's why you want to do it, right? That's kind of obvious, but no. And that's why, you know, I started this presentation by saying that I really do believe that our political leaders and many of our leaders in business are just no better than 19th century mercantilist plunderers. It's really what they are.
Ken, you had a rural upbringing near Taree.
Yeah.
How did your early rural life and experience shape your ideas? I mean, you've said to us that our tax system is inequitable,
Yeah.
it's inefficient,
Yeah.
it's not sufficient for future government spending.
Yeah.
How did that early life shape your ideas and values about Australia and its social, cultural and economic needs?
Yeah. Well, firstly, my father was a timber worker. He was a logger, and he used to cut railway sleepers too on the weekends. And I'd go out to the bush with him, see him cut railway sleepers. He tried to be a dairy farmer, but the dairy farm. Well, anyway, he was in a share farming opportunity. The dairy farm went broke in a drought when I was a very young kid, and so he went back to timber work, and that's what he did for the rest of his life. And I used to go out with him when he was cutting railway sleepers on a weekend. I didn't go out with him when he was cutting logs out of the state forest during the week, but I did get the opportunity as I was growing up to talk to him quite a bit about what the hell was going on and how he felt about it and so on. And I didn't realise it at the time, but looking back on it some years later, I realised that in those exchanges, those conversations with my father, even as a young kid still in primary school, I learned a hell of a lot of economics, and I learned a lot about tax policy, and none of it was good. So I'll tell you one story. So he used to do some work for the Forestry Commission of New South Wales, as it was called in those days. And the Forestry Commission of New South Wales in those days, it's now Forestry Corporation, or New South Wales Forestry Corporation. But in those days, it was determined to convert Australia's native forests into plantation hardwood. Absolutely determined to do it. And so my father would get told to go into that part of, let's say, the Lansdowne State Forest and chop down every one of those nasty, slow-growing hardwoods that you can find, because we only want the quick-growing ones. We don't want the slow-growing ones, right? All those turpentine, slash them, lay them flat on the ground. We don't want turpentine because it's so bloody slow-growing, right? We only want the fast-growing stuff. We want to turn this biodiverse forest into a monoculture that is easy to harvest. Easy to look after, right, with fast-growing species. And we can get all our engineers to figure out the optimal harvest rates and blah, 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 and you know. Anyway, that's what he used to do. He'd go out into the forest, he'd chop down these 400-year-old trees, 500-year-old trees, and just leave them lying on the forest floor. Seriously. Years later, like after he retired, he contacted the Forestry Corporation of New South Wales, as it then was, and he said, you know that section blah, blah, blah of the whatever forest it was, I know that I chopped down 80 turpentine trees there, huge things, average age, let's say 400 years, and they'd still be there because it's turpentine, right? The bark's still on them, so it wouldn't have rotted. Do you reckon we could go in and get them? No. Leave them. That's what he was told, honestly. Leave them. Tell you another story. He used to chop down a lot of grey gums. Oh, well, he called them grey gums. I can't even remember. I can't remember the botanical name of them. But look, it doesn't matter. They're a very long-lived tree. They grow to huge trees. And one day when I was a young kid, I was still in primary school, he came home early from work. He put me and my two brothers in the car, and took us down to the local sawmill because he wanted us to see the size of this log that he'd taken out of one of the local state forests that day. So you know those big lorries or trucks that you see with saw logs on them. Typically these days, I did a count of one the other day because I live back up that way now, and so I get the opportunity to see these grey gums on the back of lorries, and I did a count of one the other day. There were 70 logs on it. Well, this lorry had one log on it. Even at the narrower end of the log, it was a very long log, but even at the narrower end of the log, it was bigger in diameter than my father was tall. And he was really impressed with this log, you know, and it was difficult not to be impressed, I've got to say, standing there looking at this damn thing. And then he started to explain why it was such an amazing thing. It wasn't the size of it that was amazing. What was amazing about it was that it didn't have a pipe, as he called it. A pipe is a hollow core. Grey gums, all of them, he thought, until this one, well, not all of them, but most, like, you know, I don't know what percentage, but anyway, the vast majority, they grow with a hollow pipe. And in those days, the sawmills would not accept a log, a grey gum, that had less than 1 foot, 30 centimetres, of solid timber around the hollow pipe. It wasn't regarded as being of millable quality. All right? This one had no pipe. Therefore, the whole thing could be millable, right? And therefore, it was worth a lot of money. Not that he got paid the money, because he was on the lowest award rate of pay that Australia had at the time, the timber workers' rate of pay. Anyway, so I started asking him questions like, you know, how much is it worth? He didn't know how much it was worth, but I said, well, oh no, he said, but this one log would make the framing for at least 3 houses, all the framing, you know. Australian hardwood's not used for framing of houses anymore. I don't know if you know that, but it's not, because we just don't have enough of it. And we've now gone to softwood. But anyway, and I said, well, I know you, I mean, obviously you don't get paid very much, so it's obviously very valuable, but that's not your money, so who gets the money? And he said, oh, well, there's royalties paid on it because it came out of the state forest. So I thought, he's not stupid, this fella, my father. How much, Dad? And he said, oh, be about $2 or $3 of royalties. Yeah, God's truth, right? And so, you know, it was downstream, starting with the sawmill, that actually got all the money out of this log. And then I said, and then we got on to the conversation, why is this log so special? He told me about the pipe. And I said, what about the ones that have got a pipe? I said, for a start, how do you know whether it's got a pipe or not? And he said, there's only one way to know, my boy, you've got to chop it down. Right. So if you chop down one and it's got a pipe, and that's most of the ones you've chopped down in your life, what happens? Oh, you just leave it there because the mill doesn't want it. Are the royalties payable? No, son, you only pay royalties on what comes out of the forest. So in his life, he chopped down hundreds, maybe thousands of these things. Average age, I don't know, 400 years. Most of them with a hollow pipe. Leave them lying on the forest floor. Forestry was very happy with him doing that because he was helping them create a fast-growing monoculture, right? And I was thinking, who do these trees belong to? And how should, and of course, even my father said, well, they belong to the people of New South Wales. Of course, they belong to the people of New South Wales, but what a return the people of New South Wales were getting. And so I think that's probably where my interest in both economic policy or public policy generally and my interest in taxation developed, and I was still in primary school.
Thank you. Before we move on to questions from you, we do have a question from one of our people who view us online. This question comes from Sam in Queensland. He says, as a young person looking at my working life before me, what tax reform measures do you believe would most effectively support young Australians in navigating and thriving in today's economy? I suppose the question, Ken, is if you have a magic wand, what would you do?
Yeah. So, it was on that last slide, really. So what I do is, I mean, we do have to find a way. Actually, let me go back. In 1972, actually, I think it must have been the Whitlam government. Maybe it was commissioned before the Whitlam government. But anyway, was the commissioning of something that became called the Asprey Review of Taxation that was published in 1975.
That's right, 1975.
That's when it was published, yeah. But I think it was commissioned in 72.
It was commissioned by McMahon.
By McMahon, you're right. So it was, yes, exactly. Well done, that's right. That's right. And then Gough had to take delivery of it, as I recall. Yeah, anyway, having not commissioned it. Its big finding was this. We have to find a way of reducing the reliance upon the personal income tax system and reducing the reliance upon bracket creep in the personal income tax system. We have to find a way of shifting the burden of taxation away from labour income and taxing the normal return to capital onto taxation of consumption and the taxation of capital gains and the taxation of windfall profits and blah, blah, blah. In 1975, nothing's changed. Absolutely nothing's changed. Well, no, that's not true. I mean, we do have a capital gains tax today. Of a sort. More importantly, we do have fringe benefits tax today. And there was no fringe benefits tax when Asprey was writing, and that's one of the things that he called for, right? So some things have changed. And of course, we do now have a GST. But let me reveal a little number to you, a little statistic to you that worries me a bit, scares me a bit actually. Having fought, as I did, with a team of people for so many years to get that consumption tax in place. Like, I was a member of Paul Keating's bunker team in the Treasury that developed what became called Option C, that he took to the National Tax Summit in June of 1985, that had as its centrepiece a broad-based consumption tax, replacing wholesale sales tax and so on, and matched with reforms to the personal income tax system to reduce the tax burden on young working people and to reduce the rate of fiscal drag or bracket creep in the personal income tax system. And of course, it also had capital gains tax and fringe benefits tax and so on, all those other bits in it. I was a part of that team. I then, somewhat ironically, got the job of developing the modelling capacity that Treasury built to allow Paul Keating, now as Prime Minister, to totally destroy John Hewson's Fight Back package, which had as its centrepiece a 15% goods and services tax, abolition of wholesale sales tax, abolition of payroll tax actually, and then a whole pile of other things. And then, of course, I was called on by John Howard to lead his tax task force that put together the consumption tax that we now have. And so 25 years after Asprey recommended it, we actually had a consumption tax, and the centrepiece of it was what we called tax mix switch. That was the language used at the time. And that was celebrated by tax policy people, maybe a handful of them. I don't know how many, honestly. But anyway, that was seen as the big goal, and we had at last delivered the centrepiece of the Asprey Review. All right, well, here's the thing. If you now add together all of the revenue collected by all of the indirect taxes in Australia, including the GST, Commonwealth ones, as a proportion of total revenue collected by the Commonwealth, that number, so total indirect taxes including GST as a proportion of total tax revenue, is right back to where it was in 1997. The tax mix switch, well, it lasted about 20 years. That's it, it's now over. And so we are now back to the position where we can't even say that we've addressed that imbalance between income tax, personal income tax, and consumption tax. Now, of course, there are a lot of people back then in 1985 who were saying, well, consumption tax is unfair. Their argument went like this. Actually, it's a very simple argument. Higher income people have a higher ability to save. And savings, what you save, well, that doesn't get hit with consumption tax, does it? Because it's only what you consume that gets hit with consumption tax. I never won any argument by saying, well, hang on, saving is just deferred consumption, you know. I mean, at some point the consumption tax is going to be paid. Never won a damn argument, right? Actually, Ross Gittins was the only journalist in the country who understood what I was saying. He wrote an editorial in the Sydney Morning, not an editorial, but an opinion piece in the Sydney Morning, a column in the Sydney Morning Herald, pointing out what we were saying. It wasn't just me saying this, it was our team who was saying this in the Treasury, that it's just deferred consumption. But here's the thing. What do you make of a tax system that taxes consumption very, very lightly and taxes income, like wages, very, very highly, when the consumption tax is about the only tax that older people pay? Right? Oh, that's equitable, is it? Try telling that to a young bloke. This concept of equity that has bedeviled arguments in Australia about tax reform forever is such a useless concept, should provide no guidance at all. But it is one of the reasons why we're now confronting this intergenerational tragedy.
There's a question over here. Ross will bring a microphone to you if you'd just like to...
Thanks. G'day, Ken. I don't really understand a hell of a lot of this stuff, but so excuse my ignorance straight up. But isn't it true that a higher wage earner proportionately pays less of their income than a lower income person when it comes to a GST?
No, only as a consequence of saving, right? So that was the argument. So the argument was the higher income earner. There are two. Is this still working?
This one.
I'm on 200 grand.
Yeah.
Someone who's on...
Yeah. No, I get what you're saying. And look, there are two. So there are two issues. So the first issue is that a consumption tax is a flat tax. It's a flat rate of tax. Yeah. And so for that reason, what you said is true. So if you switch from a progressive personal income tax system, where the average rate of tax goes up, the higher your income, if you get rid of that and you replace it with a flat rate consumption tax, then yes, obviously that's true. And then the second reason why it's argued that a consumption tax is regressive is because of the saving thing, right? Now, against that has to be set the fact that a progressive income tax system, by definition, is what produces bracket creep. And the thing about bracket creep is it is the most attractive, politically, means of raising revenue. Because people don't see it. They're not aware of it, right? It is a cowardly way of raising revenue, and it doesn't just affect high-income people. It affects absolutely everybody who is above the zero tax threshold. Everybody's got an income above that zero tax threshold. Whenever they get an increase in their nominal wage, even if they're suffering a reduction in their real wage, they will pay a higher average rate of tax, right? So everybody is affected by that progressivity, not just the high-income people.
Question down the front.
Oh, thank you very much. One of the things that's been left hanging, I believe, from your presentation is that you said the problem in political terms is that all our political entities have 19th century economics in their head. I would add that no, they just have 19th century influences, as was demonstrated this week by the report in the Senate on what we should do about lobbyists. And the two joint parties, just released 2 days ago, this report, said that we shouldn't probably do too much about lobbyists. After all, there's only 1,700 of them on the record, and the ones that aren't on the record are employees of Rio Tinto, the gas companies, and all the other large industries. And if I'm a politician, one, I get big donations from them. I mean, I can go along and sit down to dinner and have $1,000 a plate dinner with them. And they get to talk to me directly. Oh, how lovely. And on top of that, at the end of the day, if I happen to, as a politician, make some really good decisions for them, in Canada I couldn't do it, but here I can. I can, 5 minutes after I step out of Parliament, I'm on the board of one of their companies.
Question, sir.
Is we have, if we do not, all these issues that you've brought up are subject to this same influence. That we have politicians who are under the influence of the strong interests, and therefore Senator Pocock tried to bring some reform in, and it was knocked on the head by both major parties who enjoy the donation system as it is, and they enjoy the careers they can have post-politics, which would make us all think they're opportunists.
We might take that as a comment.
I'm not going to argue the point. I'm not going to argue the point, right?
We've got time for 2 questions, one here and one here.
Thank you very much, but I am really concerned for the future. And I was out protesting outside an MP's office, but I won't add comment. Thomas Piketty says that the US is a failed state because of the disparity in the economic situation between the rich. He calls it now an oligarchy. Australian politics is copybooking, the right wing particularly, American political strategies that are going to be alienating and devastating. And you've demonstrated that the next generation are going to wear this. Tell me something positive we can do now. Not just all the fuck-ups from the... Oh, excuse me, you've never heard that word before. What we can do now that will try to give these young people a fairer go, because they're putting the solid work in. And I can't leave here feeling this depressed, sorry.
Yeah. Look, that is a really serious question, and the observation that America is a failed state, well, that's a reasonably well-based observation in economic terms, right? In economic terms. But as I've said to you, when I think about what the mission of our political leaders should be, that it should be a mission to leave to future generations the opportunity to enjoy a better standard of living than we, this generation, enjoy. Well, we can't say that either. We can't say that either. And so that is a failure as well. But it's not a failure that it's too late to solve. It's not too late to solve this. The reason I've been talking about it is not because I want to make people unhappy. Well, I'm not sure they are, right? I mean, so some people are unhappy and some people are rolling in it. What I want to do, and what I think we need to do, is bring attention to that simple fact that a lot of people are happy, and in fact it's an increasing proportion of the workforce that's unhappy, and they're the people that we are all reliant upon to keep this damn thing going, to keep this economy going. And they are getting increasingly unhappy, whilst other people are doing very well, thank you very much. And it's that divide that does need to be highlighted. But it's only by highlighting it that I can see any possibility of decent reform, any possibility of redress.
Just a quick question, whether you in your career with the Treasury came across the local currencies like barter or negative interest money, lets and time banking?
Yeah. They're all bad, right? Because they make it really difficult to tax things.
So, yeah, we've got a question online, which I think that's a really okay. Sorry, I'm laughing at that answer. Yeah, Brian Mansfield has put on: was the policy of no tariffs in Australia the cause of manufacturing decline?
Yeah.
And I suppose running from that, what do you think? Like, if we're going to restore a manufacturing industry in Australia, how should we do it?
Yeah. Okay. So, no, that's a really sensible question. It's clearly the case that cutting tariffs did lead to at least part of the demise of the Australian manufacturing sector. And everybody knew that it was going to do that, right? I mean, everybody knew that it was very unlikely that any domestic car manufacturer was going to survive those tariff cuts. The tariff back in 1992 was 57%. If you cut a 57% protective tariff, that's going to have a pretty damn big impact on domestic manufacturing of automobiles, and so it happened. But here's the thing. Those tariff cuts stopped at about the turn of the century, right? So by then, that should have been history. And yet, manufacturing exports as a proportion of total exports were still increasing. Right through that period, manufacturing exports as a proportion of total exports continued to increase. What was being exported were things that we called elaborately transformed manufactures, filling niche markets. When we did the Asia in the Century white paper, we thought that was the future of Australian manufacturing, was in building things that would fit into global supply chains, things in which Australia could actually demonstrate a comparative advantage and do very well, and those were the things that were growing strongly through the 1990s and continued into the early years of this century until the resources boom came along. Right now, that proposition is under enormous threat, right? Because there's a view now that we should actually do the opposite. We shouldn't seek to involve ourselves in global supply chains, for heaven's sake. No, we should turn inwards and we should protect ourselves from the rest of the world, and we should build a domestic manufacturing capability and so on. And I understand the reason. I understand why people are toying with that idea. I just want to make the point that it's light years away from the discussions we were having 20 years ago and 30 years ago in Australia. So what has happened since 2003? No more tariff cuts. That's not what's explaining what's happened to manufacturing since then, which is when it's taken the big dive. What's happened since then is the resources boom. The resources boom, oh God, I hope I'm not about to confuse you. The resources boom led to two things very quickly. Firstly, a strongly appreciating Australian dollar. Do you remember when the Australian dollar was worth more than the US dollar? Yeah. It didn't stay there for very long, but that was entirely due to the resources boom. If you are an exporter competing, if you're an Australian manufacturer competing with imports, things made offshore, when the Australian dollar goes up in value, that's really, really bad for you. Really bad for you. So that was the first thing. Second thing that happened is that we experienced a period of strong growth in the Australian cost base relative to other countries and a decline in productivity, which I showed on the chart there, right? When you put increasing cost base together with declining productivity, you get what economists call an increase in nominal unit labour costs. I know it's a clumsy term, but it's actually a measurement of the unit cost of production. And that unit cost of production goes up because of increases in the cost base and declining labour productivity, right? So we had a combination of appreciating dollar and increase in nominal unit labour costs. When you put those two things together, you get something that economists call the real exchange rate. It's a fancy term, but that's all it is. It just puts those two things together. When the real exchange rate appreciates, if the real exchange rate appreciates by 20%, that is equivalent to taking away a 20% tariff. Okay? In terms of the impact that it has on domestic manufacturers competing with imports. It's equivalent to stripping away a 20% protective tariff, right? So, today, our real exchange rate is still 40% above where it was in 2003. So that is equivalent to us having, post-2003, stripped away a further 40%, right? And it has at times been a lot higher than 40%, 50%, above 50%, right? And so I would say, yes, you can blame tariffs, sure. And everybody knew tariffs were going to have that effect. But if you're going to blame tariffs, you also have to blame the consequences of the resources boom, because it's done exactly the same thing for another 15 years.
We're going to have to finish up there. We're already over time, I'm sorry. I think I'm going to join this lady in the third row here taking some antidepressants after tonight because it is doom. There is a lot of doom, and I'm feeling immense guilt in some ways that, I feel as if we've been conned for the last, multiple decades. I'm not attributing that doom, guilt or my antidepressant use to you, Ken, because we've really appreciated your presentation tonight in trying to give some understanding. I think the important thing is what you said, is that we need to know about this. And in some ways we've got more tools today than we had prior to the last election, in that we've got some disruptors in our parliament now, disruptors in our election ability through the Teals or the independents, more so than we've had for many a long time. And I know their focus was on climate, equality for women, and I forget the third thing now. Someone will remind me, I'm sure. Integrity was the other thing. Maybe we can convince them that they need to look at tax reform and the economy from a intergenerational perspective as a fourth thing. So that is something that gives me hope out of tonight. Thank you, Ken, for trying to explain it. Brought my economics brain back to 1973, 4, 5, I forget, with some challenges with Rob this week, but it was worth it. We really appreciate you coming here tonight and trying to share some of the things that we need to know for our economic literacy to make decisions and to influence our vote, I think. So please join me in thanking Ken. Just a quick mention of the next couple of meetings, although they seem so specific compared to what we've heard tonight. Over the next couple of months, and we'll let you know, we've got about repurposing coal mines. We've got the future, I know, I feel bad now saying that, the future of the Port of Newcastle and cyber security over the next couple of months. So we'll keep you informed about what's going on. Thank you for coming.